All right, so today we're diving deep into two cryptos that are kind of shaking things up with this whole feeless idea. Nano, yeah, most of you probably already know about Nano, but also Zenon. It's likely a bit less familiar. We've got this super interesting Medium article by Zyler9985 that breaks it all down. And the cool thing is this isn't about like declaring a winner or anything like that. It's more about like exploring how Xenon, right? It's building on what Nano pioneered, but it's tackling some of those tough challenges that come with, trying to make a system completely feeless. So ready to get into it.
Absolutely. And I think their origin stories are a great place to start. Nano, as many know, went with that faucet distribution model. You solve a CAPTCHA, boom, you get some XNO. Seems pretty simple, right? Get the coin out there to as many people as possible. But Xenon, they decided to go a different route with their bond system.
Yeah, it definitely required people to be way more active right from the start. No just solving captchas, you actually had to run nodes and put in
Yeah.
some capital to get ZNN. So why would a project choose to make things more complex like that?
Well, you got to remember the big picture here. Decentralization and making sure the network stays healthy in the long run. See, with a feeless coin like Nano, and remember the supply is fixed too, how those early coins get distributed is super important. Just imagine, and I know it's unlikely, but what if someone managed to grab a huge chunk of the total supply back during that faucet phase? Without something like inflation or staking rewards to kind of spread things out over time, that person or entity could have way too much control.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Xenon requiring nodes and upfront capital.
Mm.
That probably attracted a different kind of person early on, right? Someone who's actually invested in seeing the network succeed, not just looking for a quick buck.
Exactly. It's about building a community of people who are truly committed from day one. The article has this diagram one, that shows how this idea of diminishing returns plays out. Basically, the earlier you get involved and really contribute to a network, the more potential influence you have.
But, the article also brings up some, let's say, controversies around Nano's faucet, right?
Yeah.
Things like exploits and it shutting down before all the planned coins were given out. Does that affect Nano's decentralization in the long run?
It's definitely something people in the community talk about. I mean, the idea of the faucet was good, get wide distribution, but looking back, it raises some questions about whether they actually achieved that goal. At least in theory, Xenon's approach seems to avoid some of those risks by, attracting those more dedicated users from the very beginning.
So it's like Xenon learned from what happened with Nano and tried to build a system that encourages decentralization, like baked in from the start.
That's a really good way to put it. And this difference in how they think about things, it carries over into their tokenomics too. Nano's got that fixed supply, no staking rewards, so it really depends on the market to figure out how those coins get spread around. Xenon, well, they take a much more, let's say, hands-on approach.
I've always been a bit confused about inflation in crypto, honestly.
Uh-huh.
How does that actually help with decentralization in Xenon?
It's about diluting control over time. Even if someone, let's say a whale, got a ton of ZNN early on, their share gradually gets smaller as new tokens are created. And those new tokens, they're given to the people actively participating in the network. So it's constantly spreading out ownership.
Ah, I see. So that stops those early whales from holding on to too much power forever. Xeon's playing the long game here.
Exactly, and it goes beyond just making new tokens. Their validator setup is pretty unique. You don't just need to lock up a bunch of ZNN, you also have to burn a good chunk of QSR, that's Xenon's other token. And get this, the amount of QSR you need to burn to become a validator actually goes up over time.
Whoa, hold on. Why would they make it harder to become a validator later on? Wouldn't that keep people from joining?
It's a clever way to stop those latecomers, especially the ones with tons of money, from coming in and taking over. It rewards the people who are there early on, building the network from the ground up. Diagram 2 in the article shows how this works. Even if you had a huge stake at the beginning, it gets smaller over time.
So it's like Xenon saying, hey, if you want to be a big shot, you got to be here from the beginning, working with the community.
Yeah.
It's a really cool way to make sure decentralization sticks around.
It really is. This focus on constantly making things more decentralized, it's built into every part of Xenon, from how it started to the tokenomics and even having those two coins.
Speaking of which, how does having both ZNN and QSR help Xenon achieve its goals?
Think of it like a system of checks and balances. It stops anyone from having too much power over the whole network. Diagram 5 in the article has a good visual for this. In a normal system with just one coin, validators earn more coins, right? But then they can use those coins to get even more validators, and it just keeps going. It creates this loop where the rich just get richer and more powerful.
Yeah, I get it. It's like a runaway train.
Right. But with Zenon's two-coin system, validators only get ZNN, not QSR. And remember, to become a validator, you have to burn QSR. So even if a validator gets a ton of ZNN, they still need to go out and get QSR somewhere else to keep growing. It breaks that loop.
So even if you're a whale with lots of ZNN, you can't just take over. You still have to play by the rules and interact with the whole QSR market.
Exactly. And to make sure there's a healthy and accessible market for QSR, Zenon rewards the people who provide liquidity for ZNN. You can see this in diagram 4, which shows how some of those new ZNN tokens from inflation go to the liquidity providers.
That's really different from Nano, which kind of relies on its existing holders or those big exchanges to provide liquidity. Do you think the reliance on the existing holders could be a problem for Nano? Like, will it make it harder to get new people involved?
That's a really interesting question. I think having a strong and easy-to-use market is super important if you want a crypto to grow in the long term, and Zenon seems to be doing a good job with that.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground already. From how they got started to their different approaches to, like, tokenomics and validators, both Nano and Zenon are clearly all about decentralization, but they're taking very different paths to get there. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and see how they handle another big issue, managing their treasuries.
So, when it comes to managing their funds, Nano and Zenon, they actually take really different approaches.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious to hear more about that.
Let's start with Nano, okay? From the very beginning, they set aside 5% of all the Nano for a developer fund.
That makes sense, right? Got to
Well-
support the people building the tech.
Yeah, exactly. Development's super important for any project, but the article kind of suggests that maybe this approach isn't so great for decentralization.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, some people say that having this big chunk of money controlled by, a central group could give them too much power. Even if they don't mean to, it could influence how decisions are made. And that kind of goes against the whole idea of a decentralized system, right?
Yeah, totally. It makes you wonder, like, who's actually in charge of that money and how do they decide what to do with it?
Exactly. And is it all transparent? Does the community have any say? Well, that's where Zenon does things completely differently. They don't have this fixed allocation. Instead, they have something called Accelerator Z, AZ for short. It's basically a fund that's governed by the community. Anyone can propose ideas for how to use the money.
Oh, wow. So it's like built-in decentralized funding. That's pretty bold, putting that much trust in the community from the start.
It is, but it really fits with Zenon's whole philosophy of community ownership. Diagram 6 in the article shows this difference really clearly. You can see Nano's treasury is all static and centralized, while Zenon's is dynamic and open to everyone.
It's like Zenon's designed to change and grow based on what the community wants. It's a totally different way of thinking about things compared to Nano. But, okay, let's switch gears for a second. This is something that always comes up with feeless systems. If there's no cost to make a transaction, how do you stop people from spamming the network?
Ah, yeah, the spam problem. It's something every feeless system has to figure out. Nano's solution is this interesting bucket system and something called LRU, which stands for least recently used.
Okay, I'm picturing literal buckets filled with Nano transactions. But how does that stop spam?
So these buckets, they represent different account balances. Instead of prioritizing transactions based on how big they are or if they paid a fee, Nano groups accounts with similar balances into these buckets. And then the LRU part makes sure that within each bucket, the accounts that have already made a transaction recently get pushed to the back of the line. That way, the accounts that haven't transacted in a while get priority.
So it's kind of like making sure everyone gets a fair shot no matter how much Nano they have.
Exactly. It discourages spamming because you can't just keep making transactions over and over and hog the network.
Makes sense, but what happens when the network gets super busy? Does Nano have a way to prioritize those really urgent transactions?
That's where this system starts to show its limits. The article points out that while Nano's feeless model works really well most of the time, it can be hard to predict how long transactions will take, and there's no way to, pay extra to jump ahead in line. The article actually calls it socialism on the blockchain. Haha.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty striking image. So how does Zenon handle this spam problem? They're feeless too, right?
Yep, they are, and they use their second token, QSR, to create something called plasma. It's basically like network gas. But here's the difference. Instead of burning those fees or giving them to miners, in Zenon, you generate plasma by either locking up your QSR for a certain amount of time or by doing proof of work.
Oh, interesting. So even though the network itself is feeless, users still have to give up something to make transactions happen.
Right. They either lose access to their QSR for a while or they spend energy on POW, so it discourages spam without going against the whole feeless principle.
I like how Xenon finds these clever ways to make things work. The article has this diagram 7, comparing Nano's LRU to Xenon's plasma. It's really helpful. But, okay, let's say someone gets their hands on a ton of QSR. Couldn't they just flood the network with plasma and basically take it over?
That's a good question, and the article actually talks about that directly. First of all, you got to remember that Xenon's philosophy is all about embracing network usage. They don't see lots of transactions as a bad thing. They actually want people to use the network as much as possible.
So for Xenon, there's no such thing as spam, just different levels of participation.
Exactly. And they've designed the network to handle a lot of traffic. But even if someone did hoard a ton of QSR, remember Xenon's inflation model is always working in the background. That means their share of the total QSR keeps getting smaller over time.
Right. So it's not like they can just control things forever. The game's always changing.
Yeah, and there's also the proof of work option for generating plasma. If the QSR lane gets too crowded, people can always switch over to POW. It's like a safety valve.
So it's like having a backup system, just in case.
And finally, there's the possibility of the communities stepping in and making changes through governance. Although the article does say that this can be a controversial topic in the world of decentralization.
Yeah, I get that. Any talk about governance can make people worry about censorship or control, and that goes against the whole idea of decentralization.
For sure, but Xenon's community has a pretty good track record of talking things out and finding solutions that work for everyone. But hey, let's move on to another interesting part of Xenon. We've talked a lot about QSR, but there's this ongoing debate about maybe adding ZNN fees to the plasma generation process.
Okay, yeah, we talked about all the things QSR is used for. Marketing, decentralization, staking to secure the network. So why add ZNN into the mix?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people think adding ZNN fees would make the system stronger. Like, it would be harder for someone with a lot of money to just come in and overwhelm the network with plasma. But others say that it would kind of ruin what makes QSR special and weaken Xenon's unique approach.
So it's like a trade-off. Do you stay true to the feeless model, or do you make some compromises to make the system more practical? It really gets to the heart of what Xenon's all about.
I think you've nailed it. And the article ties this debate back to Xenon's big goal of becoming the most decentralized layer 2 for Bitcoin.
Wow, that's ambitious.
Yeah.
But it kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to build on top of Bitcoin, which is the most decentralized crypto out there, you got to make sure your system is just as resilient.
Exactly. And it's not just about the tech, it's about the community too. Throughout the article, there are these little sections called Know Your Alien that introduce some of the interesting people in the Xenon community. They're a pretty passionate bunch.
Yeah, I got to say, those were pretty funny. Not many crypto projects embrace memes and humor like Xenon does.
It's definitely part of their charm. They've got this rich history and all these inside jokes that have created a really tight-knit and dedicated community.
It's awesome to see a community that's so invested in the project's vision, not just the price of the token.
It's really something special. But before we get too carried away with Xenon's awesome community, let's talk about some of the new things happening in both the Nano and Xenon ecosystems. I'm particularly interested in this hypercube thing the article mentions. Sounds pretty futuristic.
All right, so let's finish up our look at Nano and Xenon by checking out some of the cool stuff they've been working on lately.
Yeah, it seems like Nano's been focusing on making their network even better, handling more transactions and fixing those congestion problems. They just released version 27 of their node software, which is all about that.
That makes sense, especially since Nano's known for being so fast. Any improvements that keep things running smoothly are definitely a good thing. But Xenon, well, they've been busy with some totally different stuff. The article talks about this new Sirius mobile wallet and something called Hypercube. I'm super curious about both.
Yeah, that Sirius wallet is pretty impressive. It's not just your average mobile wallet. It's got all these features, even Bitcoin integration, which is huge for making different cryptos work together. And get this, it has a built-in node. You can run a full Xenon node right there on your phone.
Wow, that's amazing. It really shows how much Xenon cares about giving power to the users. Being able to run a full node on your phone, that's a huge step for decentralization.
Oh, and the article mentioned something kind of weird about how the wallet was developed. Apparently, the developer, Dr. Blaze, only asked for some of the funding from Accelerator Z.
Yeah, that is kind of strange. Makes you wonder why. Maybe they're getting money from somewhere else, or maybe they just believe in the project so much that they're willing to pay for it themselves.
It definitely shows how dedicated the Xenon community is. Maybe it's a sign that they really see Xenon as something special, something with a big future.
It could be. And speaking of the future, let's talk about this hypercube thing. The article describes it as an incubator for new projects, before they're ready to launch on the main Xenon network. So it's like a testing ground where developers can try out their ideas and see how they work in a real environment before going live on Xenon.
Exactly. And the article gives 4 reasons why HyperQueb is such a good place to start. First of all, it's not just a test net. The tokens have real value, so you get much better feedback.
Yeah, that makes sense. Testing in a fake environment is one thing, but seeing how your project works when there's real money involved is way more important.
Second, it's a great way to build a community around your project before it even launches on Xenon.
Right. Having a strong community is so important for any crypto project.
Absolutely. And third, HyperCrib uses the same technology as Xenon, so it's super easy to move your project over once it's ready.
So it's like a seamless transition, no need to start from scratch.
And finally, since HyperCrib is still pretty new, it's a great opportunity to stand out and get noticed.
It's like the Wild West of Xenon. Lots of potential for new and exciting things.
And what I really like about HyperCrib is how much emphasis they put on collaboration and high standards. Everything is transparent, and the community is involved in every step of the way.
It all goes back to that idea of community ownership that we keep seeing with Xenon. As we've been talking about these two projects, it's really striking how different their communities are.
Yeah, it's a big contrast. Nano's community is definitely dedicated, but they're more focused on the tech itself. Xenon's community is way more out there, lots of memes and jokes. It's almost chaotic sometimes.
It's definitely a unique approach. It might not be for everyone, but it's a nice change from how serious most crypto communities are.
Yeah, it's part of what makes Xenon so interesting. They've created this strong sense of community, and they don't take themselves too seriously. They even have a PDF review club. Can you believe that?
That's amazing. It shows how much they care about the project. It's not just about making money. It's about learning and growing together.
It's really cool to see. But even though the article is super positive about Xenon, it's important to remember that no project is perfect. Xenon has its share of critics and potential problems, just like any other crypto.
That's a good reminder to always do your own research. Don't just believe what you read online, even if it sounds convincing.
Exactly. Think critically, ask questions, and make up your own mind.
So what have we learned today about Nano and Xenon? Both of them are trying to create a future where transactions are fast, easy, and free, but they're going about it in very different ways.
Nano is all about simplicity and efficiency. They want their tech to be as streamlined as possible. Xenon is taking a more complex approach. They're all about decentralization and letting the community shape the project.
And in a world where everything seems to be getting more centralized, maybe Xenon's model is the way to go. It makes you wonder, can a truly decentralized and community-driven crypto actually succeed in the long run?
That's the question we'll leave you with today. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep challenging the status quo.
The world of crypto is always changing, and you never know what amazing discoveries are waiting just around the corner. So until next time, keep your minds open and stay curious.